Hello, my joyful giblets, my immaculate jelly beans. Welcome to the podcast. I want to talk to you about classical theism today and its loveliness, its exquisiteness, and why I love classical theism as a theory. Why, as somebody who was formerly a naturalist, was very atheistic and materialistic, why I sort of changed my mind and now I advocate for classical theism. This episode will be brief. It will be different. I'm not going to sort of give the arguments for classical theism or even defend it against the usual array of objections. Pat Flynn has been there, done that. You can read my stuff on that on various websites. You can see the conversations I've had on various podcasts if you want sort of the lead up motivation to classical theism, or the defenses against typical objections like, how does it fit with contingency or contingent knowledge, or how do we avoid modal collapse? Got lots of stuff on that. What I want to do right now, here and now, is just consider some of the at least potential upshots. What does classical theism possibly do for us? What potential problems does classical theism solve? Is there any sort of unique role that classical theism can play in answering certain types of questions? And I think this is really important to understand. In fact, let me just mention this very quickly. Just this morning, I did an episode with Trent Horn on his podcast, and he proposed a topic: why the medieval God beats the modern God, right? And it was fun. We had a great conversation, and I do a bit more to sort of defend and motivate classical theism in that episode, which I believe he said should air next Thursday or something like that. So keep an eye out. And the reason I wanted to do this conversation is to just kind of build on some of the themes that we sort of lightly scratched in that episode. And one of those themes included some of the potential upshots of classical theism. Because aside from sort of diving into the metaphysical debates and how do we work through various puzzles and objections, I think it is really important to just try to understand what could this theory do for us if it's true, right? What might be some reasons to see this as a good theory? Could it answer things that other theories either can't answer or can't answer as well? And I actually want to say, yes, it can, big time. I think classical theism provides unique resources for a number of very fundamental issues where it can provide certainly the best, but in many instances, I think the only adequate explanation or account. So I just want to just highlight some of those, because I think this often gets overlooked, right? I mean, classical theism is often sort of on the examination table and people are taking shots at it. And I worry that sometimes that they might not realize how useful and good this theory is, or at least they don't appreciate that before they start trying to take it down. And I also, of course, want to remove this from any sort of wider religious debates. I became a classical theist before I became a Catholic. In fact, classical theism was sort of a philosophical bridge for me to religion. And this brings me to one of the, if not the major upshots of classical theism. Wait, before we get to that, we should probably talk about like what classical theism actually is, as opposed to other models of God, more contemporary models of God. But classical theism is a tradition that is very wide and deep. I would argue that it goes certainly at least back to Plato. In fact, in certain respects, I think classical theism is a sort of big tent Platonism. And we can find Plato as sort of identifying the ultimate deity as the form of the good, putting his, demiurge aside. I think we can, definitely find the initial roots of classical theism in Plato. And then it's developed sort of down the line, if you will, through Aristotle and Augustine and Boethius, but also it's very wide, right? You have pagan thinkers who are classical theists. You have Jewish thinkers, Maimonides. You have Islamic thinkers, Averroes. Of course, you have many Christian Catholic thinkers, and not just Catholic, but many Protestant thinkers then and now. In fact, Dr. James Dolezal has an incredible book called God Without Parts. He's a Protestant philosopher who defends, the very strong, if you want to call it that, Thomistic view of divine simplicity. I think it does a remarkable job. So I don't want this to be seen as like a Catholic Protestant debate or even really a religious debate at all. I want it to be seen as a sort of philosophical consideration or philosophical exploration. David Bentley Hart, for example, he's Eastern Orthodox, big defender of classical theism. And in his book, The Experience of God, he does a wonderful job surveying how many different traditions affirm classical theism. And you might wonder, well, why is that? Why is that? And I want to say one of the upshots of classical theism is that it seems to be able to provide a principled explanation ender, a principled termination point that is non-arbitrary, for where explanations can ultimately come to some sort of a rest. And I think it's important to understand that classical theism is really part of a wider project of philosophy of nature and metaphysics, where, God sort of just drops out of that wider project or that system. So let me give you just an example, right? Many philosophers down through the ages are just starting with the data of common experience, as philosophers do. Hey, there's this thing that we experience. What is it? Let us poke at it and see if we can make it intelligible. For example, change occurs. How do we make sense of that? Well, it seems like to make change intelligible, to have the conditions for the possibility of change, we need distinction between actual being and potential being, and that change occurs when sort of potential being is reduced to actual being. And that seems to require something sufficiently actual in some respect to bring that about. And then we start to get this sort of causal principle going. But other thinkers would say, it's not just change that we need to make sense of, but also compositeness, right? It seems like composite things are always kind of pointing out beyond themselves, looking for some sort of, extrinsic explanation. Seems like qualitatively finite things that are sort of arbitrarily bounded or restricted. They have like this degree of perfection, but not all purely positive perfections, right? They have this shape or this location or this degree of power or that degree of power. And it seems like all these restrictions sort of cry out for an explanation of like what put those restrictions in place. And then getting kind of deeper into Aquinas's world, we have a unique form of composition, which he calls the essence existence composition. And it seems like this actually helps to explain contingency in a way. I think contingency can help be deeper explained by compositeness. The things are, contingent insofar as their essence, their whatness is really distinct from their active existence, their isness, if you will, that these things can come apart. So what I'm doing is I'm highlighting aspects or categories of reality that many philosophers have thought these things are not intrinsically completely intelligible. None of these types of things could serve as an ultimate explanation ender. And to make any of these things ultimately intelligible, and really to have a sufficient condition for any of these sorts of things to occur, we need to transcend these categories altogether, right? And in various ways, all the different cosmological arguments are sort of saying the same thing, right? If only changing things, then there would be no changing things, right? If only contingent things, then there would be no contingent things, right? But there are contingent things, therefore there can't be only contingent things. If there were only things with a real distinction between their essence and existence, then there just wouldn't be any of those things. Because why? Because there wouldn't be a sufficient condition for being. However, because these things exist, there is a sufficient condition. So that forces us to transcend or escape these categories to find an ultimate explanation. And what we really, really need at the end of the day is something, I would argue, and I think many in this sort of great classical theistic tradition would argue, is we need something that could actually be like completely intrinsically intelligible. Bernard Lonergan talks about this in his wonderful book, Insight. Something that actually could, in principle, sort of answer all the questions about itself from within itself, and ultimately something that could provide the complete set of correct answers to the complete set of coherent questions that could be asked. So I do want to say that I think so much of the classical theistic tradition is committed to this thesis of Bernard Lonergan's, that reality actually is completely intelligible, right? That those answers do exist, even if we don't have access to them. And somebody might think that actually just is an articulation of something like the principle of sufficient reason. And if you think that's true, maybe you even think that it's necessarily true, then you need to try and end explanation in some principled way, right? And the classical theists put the term God aside, right? I think the better way to understand this is sort of just trying to understand fundamentality, right? It seems like there's good motivation to try and establish a theory of fundamentality, some way to end explanation. And then we ask, well, what sort of thing could end explanation? We've just identified all of these sorts of these things, these categories, these features, or these aspects of reality that definitely can't end explanation in a principled way. They're not self-explanatory, right? They always point beyond themselves, changing things, composite things, finite things, and contingent things, and so on, right? So it seems like if we need something that could be self-explanatory, and if there is something that's self-explanatory, it can't be any of these sorts of things, right? It has to escape all these categories. It would have to be unchanging or immutable or a sort of unactualized actualizer, right? It would have to be non-composite, which in another deeper metaphysical sense would mean it's not a composite of potency and act. And it's not composite in any of the ways that potency and act can be related, whether it's form and matter, substance, accident. And indeed, it's not composite between essence and existence, right? Its essence just would be its existence. Aquinas' commitment, right? And it's not contingent, it would be necessary. And in fact, its necessity would sort of find a deeper explanation in its sort of absolute simplicity and non-compositeness, right? So what I think classical theism really offers is a robust theory of fundamentality where we could have a principled explanation ender, right? And it just seems like, right? It just seems like if we're going to have that, if we're going to have like some theory of fundamentality, right? Then we need something that could serve as a self-explanatory fact. And it makes a lot of sense to ask, well, what sort of thing could possibly do that? And I think what people in the tradition have understood is it takes a very special type of thing, right? It would have to be sort of radically unique. In fact, it would have to be uniquely unique, since anything that is utterly simple and incomposite and whose essence just is its existence, as Aquinas would argue, is not susceptible to differentiating features or multiplication. So it would just be one thing. It could only be one and only one thing. And then sort of upon conceptual analysis of this utterly simple, fundamental fact, one following Aquinas can actually sort of unpack the traditional divine attributes, which again, I've explored in many places if people are interested in that. But I want to just invite people to think about the nature of explanation and whether you think some sort of fundamentality is required, and if that would require some sort of fact that is either unexplained or self-explained. There's a lot of debate around that. I tend to veer towards self-explanation, but that'll depend on how you think of explanation. If you think of explanation as always sort of extrinsically efficiently causal, then God isn't explained in that sense. But if you think of explanation as something that just sort of removes mystery, then the idea is that God has a very special nature, right? That if we could grasp his nature, we would just sort of see, right, the answers that Bernard Lonergan says have to be there if reality is to be completely intelligible. So I think that's one major upshot of classical theism. It seems to provide a really principled place to end explanation. It seems to be able to cash out, if you will, cosmological reasoning, traditional cosmological arguments for God in a way that I think other theories don't. And I'm not just talking about naturalism or atheism. I'm talking about other models of God that really fail to have God transcend these categories. God is still composite in some of these models. And at that point, I think you've lost a huge I just think you just lost a huge advantage, right? Because at that point, then, if you still want to be a theist, but you haven't really transcended these creaturely categories, and this is why certain classical theists like David Bentley Hart will say that to denounce, divine simplicity or classical theism just is to embrace atheism. What does he mean by that? What he means is that he doesn't think that other models of God, like, literally don't believe, like these people don't believe in God, or they believe in some like bearded, large, gentlemanly figure. He's just making the point that they haven't really escaped the category of creature, in which case it's still going to make sense to ask for an explanation of that entity, right? And then, of course, that the atheist will say, well, look, you still have brute facts too, right? So I'm just going to kind of like, shave that off and I'll just put my brute facts here. And then you just kind of get in this weird race of who can have less brute facts. But I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I think brute facts need to be driven to complete extinction. And a brute fact, of course, is something where it exists. It makes sense to ask why it exists and just nothing answers back, right? That's a brute fact. It's not a mysterious fact. A mysterious fact is where it makes sense to ask why something exists and maybe we don't see the explanation. When you posit a brute fact, you say, that's it. There is no explanation, even though this sort of thing seems to crucially demand an explanation. And I think admitting like bruteness is something that just sort of contaminates everything as far as I'm concerned. It's like as soon as you allow a little bruteness, to me, it just invites catastrophic worldview issues, including epistemological issues, skepticism, absurdism. It seems like you could just almost justify anything at that point. So yeah, I guess part of my motivations for becoming a classical theist is I was supremely dissatisfied with the sort of bruteness of atheistic worldviews. So I just thought, hey, if I'm gonna shift my worldview, then I need something on the table that could possibly bring brute facts down to zero. And it seems like the only real good candidate for that would be classical theism, because because for the classical theist, God transcends all those categories that are definitely not intrinsically completely intelligible. So that's one. I think classical theism is extremely fruitful in terms of metaphysics and ultimate explanation. Right. That's one of the, I think, wonderful and beautiful fruits of classical theism. Let me mention another one. I did talk about this a little bit with Trent, but I want to highlight it or bring it to your attention here. And that is, I think classical theism is not only really useful and fruitful for metaphysics, I think it's also useful and fruitful for metaethics. And this will be a good way to sort of illustrate how classical theism is sort of bound up with a much larger metaphysical outlook, metaphysical perspective, a much larger paradigm. It's not something just sort of in isolation, right? It's really part of a system, and people might think that that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's a good thing because I like systems. I want philosophy to be systematic. I want to kind of try to be able to explain everything soup to nuts with a fundamental theory. So I like that classical theism is systematic. But let's talk about metaethics, and we can motivate this with Euthyphro's dilemma. Right, Euthyphro's. You remember Euthyphro, right? This goes back to one of Plato's famous dialogues, where you have this sort of perennial objection that concerns morality and God. Right? Does God, or the gods in the original dialogue, but we'll just use God, does God will something because it's good, or is something good because God wills it? And neither of these are particularly attractive for a theist, anyways, because in one instance, it seems like God has to sort of look to something beyond himself. There's something sort of over and above God. So God is not, really like is as fundamental as most theists want to affirm, right? There's something sort of a controlling principle that's higher than God, if you will. Almost no theist wants to say that, right? Because we want to say that God is the most fundamental controlling principle there is. So that option is unattractive. The other one just seems to make morality arbitrary, which certainly most theists don't want to accept, but almost nobody wants to accept, right? It just seems like some things are necessarily wrong, and that's just the case. So how does classical theism help here? And it's funny because I often see people who sort of denounce classical theism or many aspects of classical theism, but they still avail themselves of the classical theistic traditional response to this, which is interesting and convenient, but I think a little inconsistent. The classical theists can say this: looking at their larger worldview, they have a particular sort of metaphysics of goodness and being, known as the sort of convertibility principle, that goodness just is being considered on the aspect of success and desirability, right? That goodness is really just sort of a due actuality, right? It's just goodness is nothing over and above the relevant features that are present in some kind of thing that are there when they are due, right? So we think that what's a good tree? Well, a good tree is one with its nice deep roots, and it's got healthy branches and leaves and stuff like that. But that's just talking about the tree's being, having the relevant features that are due to the nature of being a tree. What is a good dog? Well, it has 4 legs, it barks at intruders, and again, talking about the relevant features, the positive actualities that are due to the nature of a dog. And this is important because goodness in this sense, as Peter Geach teaches us, is a sort of attributive rather than predicative adjective, meaning its semantic content sort of shifts and slides depending on what you're talking about. So, you can know what a good tree is, but that doesn't tell you anything about what a good dog is, right? However, given this sort of convertibility thesis between goodness and being, we can apply this metaethically and to the nature of God as follows. Given that God is purely actual, as classical theism holds, he just is subsistent, pure being itself. Well, if the convertibility principle is true, which is part of this classical theistic tradition, that's going to kick in and allow us to say that God is just pure goodness itself. He's pure subsistent goodness itself. Now, this helps with the Euthyphro dilemma because you can just split the horns, right? You can say that classical theism has the unique resources because if goodness is convertible with being and God just is subsistent being itself, then he just is subsistent goodness itself. Thus, that God wills good things then is neither arbitrary nor dictated by something above God. Rather, it just is God acting according to his nature. So you kind of like, you go through the horns of the dilemma. So think about it like this. So divine simplicity does say that whatever is in God is God. And that's something you got to try and make sense of on this position. I think it can be made sense of. There's always going to be some mystery that remains because God is, of course, radically transcendent. But if we can just say that God just is perfect goodness, which just is the divine will, which just is immutable and necessary being, then, of course, there's no question either of God willing in accordance with some standard of goodness independent of him, or of his will being arbitrary. Because for the classical theist, what is objectively good and what God wills for us as morally obligatory just are the same thing. I'm sort of quoting from Eleanor Stump here. She drives this point really well in Aquinas. They just are the same thing under different descriptions. And neither could have been other than they are. And in fact, Eleanor Stump, if she's a tremendous classical theist, I think she's got so many good resources. Her book, Aquinas, really shows the fruits of Aquinas' theory in classical theism for metaethics, for a theory of goodness. And this is one of the points that she makes here, is how it's just extremely fruitful for thinking through action theory and hard moral situations. And also, this what has goodness to do with God? And she cashes it out. So I think that's another really appealing aspect of classical theism, is you can really just sort of ground the nature of goodness right in the nature of God, because God just is the subsistent good. So you get this really simplified and unified theory, which is, to my mind, extremely attractive. And it also helps to secure a very robust, objective moral landscape that is neither arbitrary nor requires a commitment to, say, an independent realm of Platonic forms or anything like that. So far, I think there's many more details that can be said and worked out about all of these things. And of course, there's always objections. But to my mind, these are wonderful making features, loveliness making features of classical theism, things that were extremely attractive to me originally, that sort of drew me towards the tradition, and have just become even more extremely satisfying to me as I've continued to go deeper into them as a classical theist. Metaphysics, metaethics, classical theism has some really powerful and unique resources here. And I'm not saying there aren't other theories or other models of God or even naturalistic theories that can't try to offer some account of morality. I'm just saying classical theism offers the best one, certainly, that I've ever seen. And it offers a very robust account of sort of our entire moral experience, which I've talked about at length with Dr. Jim Madden before as well. Let me highlight just a few other quick things. Here's one that I've talked about before, at least twice on this podcast with Dr. Matthews Grant. And I think classical theism actually gives a lot of resources to philosophical anthropology as well. So again, we're talking about philosophy being systematic, right? We want to kind of have everything sort of link up and hang together. And it hopefully, like, one's metaphysics can inform one's ethics. And, I think classical theism has that wonderful systematic unity in a way that many other worldview paradigms do not. They are often very contrived, ad hoc. They have these sort of like basic but independent components that they're just sort of there in a brute way. Classical theism, whatever else you want to say about it, whatever else you want to say about Aquinas, the dude is systematic, right? Things link up really well. Here's another thing that links up that I've talked about with Matthew's grant. I think classical theism has unique resources for helping to explain and secure libertarian freedom, right? Based on the sort of extrinsic model of divine agency, which just sort of is concomitant with classical theism. Now, there's a lot of details to this, so I can't go into all of it now. But I think one of the best ways to sort of just motivate this of how, and by the way, I'm a very common sense philosopher. I'm sort of one of those guys that that there's just certain data for me, right? That just seems like this is obviously true. So I need a theory to make sense of it. And look, libertarian agency just seems obviously true. I need a theory that makes sense of that. Any theory that can't make sense of that or has to deny it, that is a huge cost to that theory. Same thing with like morality. It just seems like an objective sort of moral landscape is something I need to make sense of. Any theory that either really struggles to make sense of that or has to sort of deny it altogether, those are all costs to that theory. So talk about, libertarian agency, it's sort of opposite is determinism, right? And some we can say something is sort of determined or necessitated when there's a factor that is both logically prior to and sufficient for it, right? And what I want to say is minimally classical theism sort of wipes away the threat of determinism. Why? Well, think of sort of comparative ontological landscapes. So, and again, you're just going to have to listen to my conversation with Matthew's grant if you want more detail on this, right? But remember that classical theism holds that God is simple, he's immutable, he's eternal, and he doesn't change intrinsically. There's no gears that need to rotate. He doesn't alter intrinsically when he creates, right? This is why scholastics have this commitment that God bears only a rational or logical relation to creatures where they bear a real relation to God. And that's really just talking about, what's going on ontologically. It's not to say that God doesn't really love us or something like that. Those are all caricatures. It just means there's no real foundation in God for the creature because God doesn't change intrinsically in any way when he creates. So think about it like this. In a world where God doesn't create, there's just God existing, right? Who just understands himself perfectly and understands in his one simple intuitive vision all the ways that anything could exist and really all the reasons it might be good for other things to exist. So we can say there's God and God's reasons in that world, even though we don't think that those are necessarily distinct, right? But then when God creates, there's God with God's reasons still. Then there's what he creates, the effect, call that E. And what else? Well, there's the causal dependence relation between God and E. And what's cool about this model is that there's nothing sort of on that ontological scene. There's no factor that's both prior to and sufficient for that effect, meaning we can actually avoid the threat of determinism, right? So if God sort of, let me try and unpack it this way, right? So since God isn't determined by any of his reasons, right? We believe God is perfectly free as well. And given other commitments within classical theism, such as God's action is basic, he doesn't work through any intermediate channels. It's basic and immediate, and God's action is in the patient, right? What's really kind of the critical causal commitment within the wider Aristotelian paradigm is the action of the agent is in the patient. So whenever God causes something, what's sort of essential to that is that something is brought about. Something extrinsic to God is either brought about, but that doesn't require anything in God changing or rotating or anything like that. And this avoids. This is a really cool model because it not only avoids the threat of determinism by not introducing any factor that is both prior to and logically sufficient for any effect. It also really sort of pushes all contingency extrinsic to God, which has other, I think, theoretical advantages that I've explored with Matthew's grant before. So, for example, God, let's just analyze this quickly. God and God's reasons, they are prior to E, the effect, but they're not logically sufficient for the effect because God didn't have to create. It didn't have to act on any of the reasons that impressed him, so to speak, right? Now, E, the effect is logically sufficient for E, whatever that God creates, but it's not prior to E, and neither is the E's sort of causal dependence relation on God. That just comes along with E. And what I'm saying is this model doesn't show you like how the mechanics of libertarian free will work. What I'm saying is the advantage is this model it sort of escapes the immediate threat of determinism. So this is a model where it seems like we have room for libertarian agency with God's universal transcendent causality. Another way to make sense of this, what Barry Miller talks about, is God. We have to remember that God's causality is a primary causality. Everything else is a sort of secondary causality. So God's causality isn't like any creaturely causality. God's causality is the limit case cause. God doesn't act on anything when he causes. It's God's action that there is anything else that can act at all. So, right, God doesn't cause Socrates to freely raise his leg. Rather, we should think in terms of external causal operators. God causes that Socrates freely raises his leg. And given this extrinsic model of divine agency, which just is the classical theistic model, there's nothing there that should cause us to think that that is incompatible with Socrates really freely raising his leg, that he doesn't sort of maintain a sort of counterfactual power, as weird as it sounds, sort of over God, that if Socrates freely rose his arm instead, we would just say that God caused that Socrates freely raised his arm. So as somebody, for me, again, sort of a libertarian agency was something I felt like I need a model to make sense of this. It seemed like classical theism was really unique in being able to provide the resources to at least eliminate the immediate threat of determinism by not bringing sort of anything on the scene that was both prior to and logically sufficient for any effect. I've never seen a naturalistic proposal that can offer those resources, and I think that virtually all the other models of God that have God sort of changing internally before he creates, say, forming some intention or decree, what that seems to me is that is introducing some factor that is both prior to and logically sufficient for whatever the effect is. And then it seems like whatever that effect is, it's thus determined, right? So yeah, that just seems like a really cool upshot, or at least potential advantage. Maybe there's other objections or reasons to think that you can't make sense of libertarian agency. But here's like one kind of like really cool thing right away that at least makes room for the possibility of libertarian agency within a fundamental theory in a way that I think other sort of fundamental theories have enormous, if not insuperable, difficulties. So yeah, I think how's that for an episode? Oh, here's another cool thing. If God is sort of if he's eternal and outside, if you don't put God in time, then you can actually God can be really useful to explain the perpetuation of time, what keeps time moving forward. Now that might commit you to an A theory of time, which certainly I don't think is the end of the world. I think there's some good arguments for an A theory of time. And Robert Koons has a cool argument for that, that it really seems like the sort of perpetuation of time is something that sort of requires an explanation. In fact, let me just quote Koons on this. So this might be another advantage of classical theism, or at least of not putting God in time, and God having a sort of strict timelessness is definitely a commitment of classical theism. Koons says this: the A theory of time is a theory that there is a metaphysically unique present moment that is constantly in motion. The A theory implies the pure passage of time. Hence, there are real events constituted by the arrival of the present to each new moment. If the A theory is true, then we can sensibly ask for the cause of the perpetual forward motion of time. One more paragraph. If we assume on Aristotelian grounds that the cause of the forward motion of time consists in the activity of a substance, an agent, then we must ask whether the agent acts in time or timelessly. Once again, the possibility of the activity of the agent in time can be excluded, since the agent's activity has to be actual at a time in order to act as a cause at that time. Therefore, it cannot cause the actuality of the presence of a moment of time t by acting at t, since it could act at t only if t is already, that is, independent of its own action, actual then. It cannot actualize at t its own activity at t without vicious circularity. However, the cause cannot actualize t by acting at any other time, since there can be no action at a temporal distance, no action over a temporal gap. So there's a little teaser. I know Dr. Koons has presented that consideration, if you will, in various places. The quote I pulled is from an awesome volume called Neo-Aristotelian Perspectives in Metaphysics. So that might be another advantage of classical theism, especially of not putting God at time, is if you're committed to an A theory and we want to try and explain the perpetuation of time. It seems like God as eternal, understood as a sort of yeah, as atemporal, strict timelessness can be very fruitful there. What else? What else do I love about what else makes classical theism so delicious? You know what? Why don't you guys chime in? Yeah, I know not all of you are classical theists. We've had many people who listen to this podcast with many a different controlling paradigm. But if you are a classical theist, I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear you mention something in the comments that you think is and let's say some nice things. If you've got a lot of disparaging things about classical theism, you know, we always welcome good conversation, but we always want, and in fact, I demand civil conversation. But I'd be curious if you're somebody who either became a classical theist like I did, or just sort of, you know, maybe was a classical theist and studied it more. What do you find attractive about it? Are there any points that I've missed? What else does it do for you, so to speak? I'll finish, leave a comment and let me know. I'll also finish with sort of this brief consideration of simplicity and explanatory success. So although the primary motivation for classical theism, I think, is just doing old-fashioned philosophy of nature and metaphysics and sort of getting that traditional sort of metaphysical proof, if you will. A lot of philosophy of religion these days is into the sort of worldview comparison thing, worldview debates, where you kind of formulate a little theory and then you assess that theory according to certain, you know, whether it has certain virtues or vices. How well does it explain things? What's its explanatory sort of range and depth? How contrived is it? How well does it fit with things we already know or already talking about? And how simple is it? And even though, you know, I have mixed feelings about this method in general, I'm much more attracted to the traditional way of just doing philosophy of nature and metaphysics. I think classical theism does really well in these type of debates. I mean, first off, it's hard to imagine a simpler fundamental theory if you're committed to divine simplicity. I mean, in terms of, in terms of simplicity, we think it sort of matters most on the fundamental level. And for the classical theist, I mean, we've got, like, I think the best theory you can have in terms of both quantitative and qualitative simplicity, right? And I talked about that more in depth with Dr. Joshua Sijuwadi, who is somebody who himself moved towards classical theism and actually eventually Catholicism, thinking about worldview debates and actually thinking it in a way that sort of Swinburne does. So that's that. If you want more on the simplicity of classical theism, listen to my conversation with him. I also just think it's enormously predictively successful, and more so than other sort of more modern notions of God for various reasons and sort of deeper principles that and commitments that come with the classical theist worldview, like the diffusiveness principle. And if you want to learn more about the diffusiveness principle and how this helps with predictive success, and this is, of course, is another traditional commitment with classical theism, head over right away and listen to my conversation with Dr. Joshua Sijuwadi, and I think you'll see what I'm talking about. But I'm going to end it there. Make sure to leave a comment. This wasn't a live stream. I'm trying to mix it up a little bit more, do live streams, but also do just independent uploads, because I don't know, people tell me YouTube likes that sort of thing. Help this channel grow, guys, please do. I count on you. I don't advertise it, you know, but I do try to provide as best content as I can. So if you get value out of here, do me a couple things. Comment on the video, like the video, even if you hate it, subscribe and share. We're like getting close to that first 1,000 subscribers. That's a big landmark. Help us get there if you like what we're doing. You guys are great. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.